everyone. It's Sam McBride and Kristen Holstrom for another episode of Queens Off the Clock. Today, we are getting back into the Idaho 4, and Kristen and I are starting to analyze the evidence that is coming out, going through it, questioning everything, and really just kind of looking at potential alternative theories. Just as a reminder, these are Kristen and I's opinions. It's fun for us to kind of go through and see what everyone is saying online. We'll give shout outs to people whose videos that we see. But for the most part, we really want to get into this case. So I'm going to jump into it. So today, what I want to talk about is, again, Idaho 4. The part of the Idaho case that we really want to talk about is the surviving roommate, Dylan, and what she told the police that night, and how that narrative really squarely contradicts what was reported by law enforcement. So it did indicate that she heard people awake. And as mainstream media and most people know, the theory out there is that these took place while the roommates were sleeping. So this really turns everything on its head, and it kind of draws the question of, why wasn't this brought to all of our attention initially?
So because of the non-dissemination order that was in place forever, right? I mean, even when I just started really getting into this case earlier in 2025 and deep diving, it's like information gets out, whether it was leaked or whether it was someone making a statement and then it just kind of snowballs. It's now that we're actually getting the interrogation and the statements. I don't believe that we're getting as much as the mass public wants to think we're getting. I think Hitler is still being very calculated with what A is being released to the public and B, what is being released that's not redacted. There's been quite a few pieces of documents that conversations between the attorney and the judge that were had in open court are being redacted, which I don't understand why that is necessarily redacted. There's a good conversation that I was noticing between one of Ann Taylor's associates and Hitler, and it was pages long. You could tell they were going at it about something, and it was related to the alternative suspect. But I just think that information got out to the media and the public, and then it was just repeated and repeated and repeated as if it was absolute truth. And I think that that has had a huge impact on this case. And now that we are still getting very limited information, in my opinion. What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, and I agree, and I think I always wrestle with the idea that anyone can get it totally right. And I think that's true for prosecutions, that's true for the public, but to think that you can recreate perfectly what exactly happened in a crime scene, I think there's a little bit too much ego there, right? And so that's why, again, Kristen and I want to challenge this stuff and look at it. It doesn't mean we have one opinion or another on a specific subject. We'll let you know if we do. If there is something that contradicts it, I'd like to believe that we should continue to follow the evidence. And so why would we ignore a statement that would really change the dynamic of this horrific set of murders? So what we're talking about with Dylan's statement, according to newly released documents, Dylan initially told detectives that she was awakened in the early morning, opened her room door, and heard a male say, "It's okay, Kaylee, I'm here for you." That detail, a voice calling Kaylee's name, later disappears from versions of the statement.
Okay, I have so many issues with that. My first issue before I even get to that statement is that we have been made to believe through, people again leaking evidence or just statements by, the quote unquote survivors, is that everybody was asleep in the house. And that statement right there completely contradicts that everybody's asleep in the house. And now, I mean, everyone has different stories or different beliefs, but I think with the information that's been coming out, I don't know if anyone was sleeping. Maybe Ethan, Xana, we all know, was getting the DoorDash. Clearly, Dylan's not sleeping. It's still questionable whether or not Bethany was sleeping. I don't personally think she was. And then we have Kaylee and Maddie. And I don't know that really anybody in that house was sleeping. But it's very clear to me that people were walking around that house. And I think Dylan actually said that initially that she thought that intruder was talking to Xana, but then after, collecting her thoughts and reassessing what she had just been through, that she realized she believed now at that point that it was Kaylee. And so I'm just kind of like, well, what is it? Those are pretty big details during a quadruple homicide to just kind of throw out there.
And remember, this is not that large of a dwelling. That's
No.
something that strikes me as someone who has been a roommate. I've had more roommates than I could possibly count, and it's noisy to have one roommate, let alone a whole pack of roommates. So that's kind of hard for me to digest too, the idea that everyone would not be woken up very quickly, even if they were sleeping. It seems like a hard place to peacefully sleep for a long period of time through. So that's confusing to me. And so if you really look at it publicly in the early reporting, investigators are describing the victims as again being attacked while they're asleep. But by Dylan's accounts, but by her accounts, the name calling, at least someone in the house may have not been asleep when the violence began. So how does that then change the rest of the prosecution's narrative and how the crime went down? And is that so substantial that maybe there's more involved than we really have thought through?
Yeah, and you have to think that when you hear that for 2 years, right? It's being put in front of you. It's basically be shoved into your brain and your thought process. You eventually, well, some people start to believe that, whether or not there's any factual basis to support it. But I remember clearly it was, oh, all 4 roommates were unalived while they were sleeping, right? That was the initial, and then things started coming out, and people started asking questions. Okay, well, how is Xana asleep if she's ordering DoorDash? And then we hear that Dylan was, pretty clear in her statement that she heard someone talk, and then it was, well, I had a lot to drink that night. I didn't know if I was dreaming. I didn't know if I was awake. I mean, yes, I do think that they had a lot to drink, but I don't know how much of that I think was backing out of a corner and protecting yourself a little bit. But
Yeah, and I
I
think
don't think
too,
they
like,
were all asleep.
memory is messy, right? And we all like to believe we have perfect memories, and some of us have better memories than others. But, like, to your point, Kristen, you repeat a story enough times, at some point, you're kind of remembering the story you're telling, maybe, and not being a person in that scenario. I'm not suggesting that she's lying, maybe, that's a possibility. But, it's not necessarily unusual for a statement to shift. But when we're looking at memory and we're looking at the time lapse from these events to now, you would think that we would want to rely more heavily on the statements that were made immediately following those events, not the statements that are made thereafter, where maybe she is in a position to have been, even if like subconsciously influenced to go along with a certain narrative, or here's so many narratives that now this is the one that she's sticking to, or maybe she knows that she's not really being honest. I don't know. I don't.
And that one contradiction, it's one of the central friction points of the case. And some people believe that the intruder was already in the house, when the unalivings took place. I'm still analyzing all that information. And I do think there's some very big questions that I would like answered or evidence to support more which way I'm leaning. But if you think the intruder is in the house, then it's a different analysis, right? We need to find out exactly who was in that house without question. If it's someone breaking into the house, I think it opens up the intruder pool or the suspect pool significantly more because we have someone from the outside coming in. Or was it both? Was there someone in the house? Was there another person that came into the house and there was more than one suspect? I think that is a very big, probability in this case.
Huge
I
point.
but it's a
Huge point.
totally different analysis if you are saying the intruder was in the house and they were all sleeping versus the intruder was out of the house and one was sleeping. I mean, that's 2 different analysis.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Kristen, because now you're potentially changing the motive or the opportunity. Was there somebody else involved? Was there someone different involved? Was there someone that wasn't necessarily trespassing involved? Like, all of these are the questions that we have. And I think that the evidence is contradicting the mainstream story. And so it makes sense to look into it a little deeper and think these things through.
And then there's people that say for the most part that Maddie was the target, and there's people that say that Kaylee was the target. And it's not uncommon for statements to shift, under stress. And like Sam said, memory is messy. I mean, sometimes I have a hard time remembering what I did last weekend or was it the weekend before. And there are discrepancies, but I just think so early on information was put out there and then it's like we're sticking to it. We're doubling down, and then I think new information might have been coming out that they were privy to, or law enforcement and the detectives, but necessarily not most of us as the general public. I do believe that we should be in on that information. But I just think the different scenarios, was there noise? Were they taken by surprise? Because again, those create a possible different scenario. If one of those girls was the target, why? And nobody to this day has really come out with a really strong position of exactly who the target was and unequivocally why, right? There's
Yeah.
some people that say, oh, he connected to the Wi-Fi of Lucky Creek where Maddie worked, but we can't prove that he went in there or he ever ate there, right? But that if they're saying Kaylee was the target and she was obviously the one that had most of the facial distortion from the assault, why was she the one that, you know, was suffered so much injury that she was unrecognizable? So was she taken by surprise? Was she not? Was it someone they knew? Was it someone that they had never met?
Yeah, and that's why this stuff is so important, right? Is because we really don't have those answers. Even though we have a conviction, we don't really know truly what happened, and we're still limited in the information that we can analyze, and we still certainly don't have it all. But from what we're seeing, there's a lot of contradictions that raise some pretty serious red flags. Yeah, and another confusing detail that I want to kind of talk about. Some versions of the witness accounts say that Xana, who suddenly allegedly ran up the stairs, possibly because she was awake and returning from her DoorDash, and that her movement may have been interpreted by the attacker. Investigators later suggested that Xana may have confronted the killer and suffered trying to stop them. But if Xana interrupted an attack upstairs, that would explain why she may have defensive wounds from the scene and shows signs of a struggle away from the bed. Again, variations in the wording across reports and documents, leaves room for competing theories, and that's again the problem. And I also want to talk just briefly about the Unfiltered Lucky podcast that Kristen and I sort of reviewed and looked at. And I think it brought up a really interesting point. So allegedly, Dylan originally said that she heard Kaylee and Murphy on the second floor dancing and laughing. She went up the stairs yelling as loud as she could. Someone was in the house. What do you
No,
think
that's
about that, Chris?
wild. And I have heard that from multiple sources. And the first time I heard it, I think I kind of brushed it off. And then I heard it again. I don't know if anybody who's really, really following this case notices that things are being scrubbed from the internet. So it is not super easy to find really a whole lot of content about this case going back. Like if you go in and you put in Idaho, Brian Koberger, quadruple homicide testimony or reports, little by little, that content is getting less and less and less. So I was actually just Googling something very specific or chat GPT, just trying to get some specific information. And there is less and less content out there about this case each and every month. And I encourage everybody, go out there, try to go back, get content from even last year. You're going to have a hard time. I think there's a lot of content being scrubbed from the internet about this case. But I had heard that before, and I was actually trying to go back and find where I specifically had heard it. I have heard that it was said that somebody was in the house and that somebody had a knife.
And so this is where I just don't understand. That changes everything for me.
It changes everything.
So, and is someone in the house that they know, even if loosely? Because why is there not an altercation right then?
I'm with you, Sam.
Possibly.
No, I'm with you. So I am there too. I don't know that I think anybody was asleep. I think at least one of the intruders. I do think there was more than one. I think somebody was in the house. I think that this analysis would have been completely different if the narrative from the onset was that Dylan said circa 2022 that somebody was in the house.
Now,
I
let me
think
ask
this
you
is a
this.
completely different analysis.
Let me ask you this. So, with this white Elantra that's reportedly circling the residence and then quickly leaving between a small time frame, I know one of the things Kristen and I always talk about, and I want to ask you, Kristen, is the small amount of time for this to have reportedly occurred where there's 4 unalivings. So, my question is, if possibly, and I might be wrong, but possibly there's someone else helping, could it be that someone's circling in a car kind of
Well, somebody
frantically
else
while
is
someone else is inside? and then booking away from the scene thereafter, which would allow the possibility that somebody was maybe in the house for a longer period of time. And maybe there's more to just running in for a couple of minutes and miraculously, really, and horrifically being able to do this to 4 people and leave in such a small period of time.
Yeah, and if you recall, there was no evidence of, like, a breaking and entering, right? There wasn't broken windows, there wasn't broken glass. The back door through the kitchen may or may not have been unlocked. It was not uncommon, it was not odd behavior for that to be unlocked at times. You know, I've had a lot of people reach out to us and they were like, "I wish you could just understand in Idaho that you don't lock your doors." So I understand that small town vibe, but it is very likely that this person that was in there or these people had some sort of relationship with the roommates. And
But
whether or
it
not
also
they were all
sounds
besties, I don't know,
right.
but I don't see that somebody came in with a weapon and literally had people sitting against the wall in duct tape.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know where I saw it, but I saw a clip of some, like, previous, like, noise complaints that were
Well, they had
called out to the
many,
property,
many.
and the one that I had most recently watched, I forget where I watched it, but it seemed like they were going to this house and nobody that lived there was there.
Oh, yeah, I know exactly the one with Kaylee and it's the officer, and he's like she's clearly annoyed, and she thinks that, at first, before Kaylee even goes out, the friend answers the door, he's like, "Yeah, nobody's here." And then I think ultimately Kaylee ends up coming out, and I think she feels like this guy's, just trying to see her. I think he even takes a picture of her ID. There's just a lot of weird, you know what, stuff go on in Idaho, but there are so many questions that I have. And before we even get to Dylan's statement, this is what really gets me going in this case, and I just have to ask you, when you're watching the body cams, right, when 911 was initially called hours and hours and hours later, and the first guy goes in, and then he goes back to his vehicle. They all have the body cams on. It is crazy to me that these witnesses, roommates, are not separated. They are not separated initially. They're kind of just standing there. I mean, just the way that this investigation has gone down, it just looks so juvenile. It looks like this is the first investigation that's ever happened. There were so many things that were done so poorly.
Yeah, and that kinda goes back to my point of I think it's really important to continue to follow the evidence and not necessarily ignore that, even if a piece of evidence would make the conclusion that we've come to in this case something else. And I think that that problem gets compounded by potentially an investigation that isn't doing things like separating witnesses. It goes back to the memory issue, right? Like if you're not being separated and you have a memory of events and you're listening to one, two, three different people
And
repeat
then the
what
neighborhood
happened.
friends are coming over, which is another issue for me is like, why are we calling our friends if we don't really think anything's wrong and just maybe Xana had too much to drink last night? Why are we calling our friends to come over? But now we have the roommates, right? And now we have friends and we're contaminating a crime scene. But hey, let's just all sit outside and cry and talk about it together. It's just it's
And
one
then
thing
at
when you
some
hear about
point,
it, but then to see it,
well, and
it's
then at
crazy.
some point, does someone have a slightly different version of events, but because they're concerned about reporting inconsistently to law enforcement, that they sort of stay in line and stick to the quote unquote story? And this could be for people that are totally innocent, by the way, of committing the crime, but the investigation is potentially being compromised.
Yeah, and I think to this day, we still don't have a single still picture or image of Brian in the car, in the same frame as the house. I mean, we all know that the white Elantra is probably one of the most common vehicles in a college town. I don't think other potential suspect cars were followed through the way they should have, but the white Elantra is not an absolute, we solved the case for me. And it's just not. Even watching in the Dateline, I think they really did a really good job of making it more dramatic. I think there possibly could have been another person involved that was maybe the lookout. I think that cell phone towers, like cell phones were jammed from making calls or texting. I think there was some pretty high level stuff going on. And to be frank, I don't know that we're ever going to know what the truth is. And I can tell you as a parent, yes, I would want to be able to move on with my life and give peace to the victims. And we always want to remember that there was four amazing college kids that lost their lives in this. But I would also want the truth. As hard as that would be to continue digging through the layers, I would want the truth.
Yeah, and I mean, that's sort of the point of our podcast, right? Is not to just say this is exactly what happened as stated by the prosecution all the way through to the conviction. And even if so, even if we have the right guy, do we have the right timeline? Do we have the right series of events? Is there evidence that we should be looking at? Is there someone else that we should also be looking at? And that's why I think that this stuff is so important and interesting to go through. We certainly feel for the family and we want them to have their closure, and we mean no disrespect in any of those ways. It's just now that more evidence is coming out, it's interesting because there are very significant contradictions and things aren't matching up. And typically, if things aren't matching up, there's either a reason for it, and maybe it doesn't totally affect the investigation, but these seem to be pretty big principal points in the case and the theory of the prosecution. People are not asleep. Maybe there's other people involved. Who knows?
I agree with you, Sam. And I think that there's, circumstantial evidence on both sides of this that are favorable to Brian and then, not favorable to Brian that actually may lead to the conclusion that that he did it or he was a part of this. And I truly don't know 100% of where I fall exactly on that. I do think he was part of it in some capacity, whether that was, a CI and it was, it was done it's supposed to be done in a controlled environment that went really, really bad, or, if he was involved in some other way. I'm still looking and craving for that evidence that we can follow that is the aha moment. I'm just not convinced we're gonna get that unless we all do it on our own together. But I do think there are enough aha moments the other way that is like, wait, how did we get to C? Did we skip A and B?
Especially remember there's no trial and Brian didn't take the stand. And maybe if he did, he wouldn't have given any sort of confession or version of events that would have been anywhere near the truth. Maybe that's possible. But because we went from plea to conviction and now we're looking through the evidence, there really wasn't that trial. And so it's hard to be able to really analyze exactly what happened. We don't even have the words from Brian other than that he's taken a plea. So he's not saying, no, 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 this is where you're wrong on these contradictions and this is how this went, or no, there was someone else and I don't want to name that person because I'm concerned about naming that person, or here there's a reason why. And so without really any other evidence, we have to look at what we haven't been able to look at predating the start of the anticipated trial, which we no longer have.
I really, really, really wish this trial would have happened, but I also understand that, the defendant I could see how his attorney basically was saying, look, every argument I'm putting out there is being shut down. That, Hitler did not even really entertain any alternate suspect theory, wasn't even going to allow the argument to be made on its own or really even bringing up in cross examination without, in essence, his approval. And so I can see how someone would make a decision regardless of whether or not they did or didn't do it, really to avoid the death penalty. I think that happens a lot more than people think. And I think it's kind of an ignorant statement to say, well, he must be guilty because no innocent person would take a plea deal if they didn't do it. And unfortunately, that's really not how the justice system works. You can be found guilty for something that you really truly didn't commit. And when the death penalty is on the table, I think that's a different analysis. But I wanna leave it with a couple things for everyone to think about, and I want to continue this big questions conversation because I think we have about 50 more, and I always need Sam to, keep me in line, keep me on track because my little squirrel brain can go 100 different directions. But kind of a mini aha moment for me is when you're looking at the crime scene photos, right? Of where the table is and the red Solo cups, clearly where they were playing, beer pong, and the table literally is very close to the bottom of the stairs. And again, as Sam and I have said, this is a small house. It is a very narrow house. Okay? I don't know exactly. I will have to go look at the picture, but the vast majority of those red cups were standing up. And if we're going to entertain the theory where Brian or the suspect was running down the stairs after Xana because Xana startled them or heard the noise and ran up to see what was going on, and then they were running after him down the stairs, how the heck do two grown people run down the stairs, literally fighting for your life for one of them, and just magically avoid from hitting the table and knocking down all of the red solo cups? How is that even possible? Now, if there were 6 solo cups on the floor, you might get my attention there. But there is no possible way that two grown adults, Xana allegedly running and fighting for her life, just magically turn sideways to run through that little area past the table to her room and nobody knocks over a single solo cup? Come on. Okay.
Very
What
interesting
do you
to
think,
think
Sam?
about.
What do you think, Sam?
Well, I mean, I just keep circling back to, I mean, you're never going to really know exactly, was it in the house or out of the house? And if that was assume that that was the first attack, how many people slept through that? Assume it's on the other end, there's still someone reportedly sleeping through that.
Don't even get me started. That's a whole nother episode with the noise. That is a whole other episode with the noise. But no, I agree. And did Maddie say that somebody was in the house with a knife, or did Kaylee say that? If so, what approximate time was that? You know?
Yeah,
What I
a
think
lot of
that little by
questions.
little we're making progress. I do think that people are looking at this case with a much more objective mind. And I mean, this is what our justice system is about, right? Let's get it out there. Let's walk through it. Let's talk through it. Let's find the truth. I know there's a lot of content on Reddit. There was kitchen photos, that have come out in the crime scene. And in one of the pictures, the room looks completely untouched. And in another picture, there's a blue bowl that wasn't there in the picture before. So, what picture was edited? What is authentic? What is real? Will we ever know?
It's a good question. Well, Kristen and I will be right here going through everything with all of you. As a reminder, like and subscribe. We're family law attorneys by day. We are not criminal attorneys. We're just here for fun, entertainment purposes, giving our opinions regarding the facts and the evidence that we see. We're here to challenge everything. We want to continue to do that. And really just it's one of those cases that I just can't see we'll ever run out of stuff to talk about. I don't know about you, Kristen.
No, and I remember when I first heard that he was accepting a plea deal, I just felt like there was so much that I wasn't getting answered, and I don't like unfinished business. I I don't care if I have to do it for years and years. I want to continue to work the problem to find a truth that I believe is either true or that I'm happy with. And I just felt like the rug was pulled out from under us. But I can tell you, I never more than I do now want to continue working the problem to bring up these questions. And I'm going to leave it here. I would love to know what you guys think. Was the intruder in the house? Was the intruder out of the house? I highly recommend you go over to.
Unfiltered Lucky podcast was where we found that information.
Yeah, I really like him. And
Yeah,
it's super
it was a
organic.
really good episode. So we highly encourage you to go look at that. It's I think quite a game changer, really. If those facts are true, I think it, like Kristen is saying before, changes the motive, changes the opportunities.
Yeah, and I like the way that the questions were presented in an organic way. And I'm not gonna lie, I was listening to it on the way to a soccer game super early, over the weekend, and then it just got my wheel spinning. And I'm texting Sam, and I'm like, "Oh, we got to look more into this." But did Dylan hear that? Did she forget about it? Did she not remember correctly? Did anyone else admit that the intruder might have been in the house? Were things left out of the report? Could people not remember because they were intoxicated? I just think that I'm really, really curious to know what everybody else thinks. So please like and subscribe. Leave in the comment. Do you think the intruder was outside the house or inside the house? Do you think there was more than one? What do you think? Let's engage positive conversation. Remember, please be kind to everybody. This is a platform that we want to encourage everyone to think for yourself don't think or believe something because it's being shoved in front of you or it's being shoved, into your brain repeatedly. Ask questions: who, what, when, how, where, why, and have organic conversation with us about these cases.
Kristen and I will change our mind. If you give us something different and you have a persuasive argument or piece of evidence for us to look at, like one thing that we don't want to do is decide definitively because we know that no one really knows. And so we want to keep challenging that. That's the whole point of the podcast.
And I'm going to leave it here to start the next one. Some people argue that the surviving roommates never saw the bodies, and others argue that they discovered Xana's bodies first. Was it before Hunter went in the house to check for a pulse? How did they know it was for drinking? Did nobody ever see the bodies? I don't know, but let's leave it there. These theories suggest that what they didn't see or what they forgot to report might be just as important as what they did or didn't say.
Until next time.